Welcome everyone to this video looking at the character of Curley's wife in John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. After watching this video, hopefully you will know everything there is to know about Curley's wife, what she tells us about women during the 1930s, and be ready to answer pretty much any question that the WJEC could ask on this character. When Curly's wife appears in an exam, I always feel quite happy, quite confident. There's so much to talk about, and also it allows you to expose how John Steinbeck comments on wider aspects of society. Now, the last time the WJC asked a question specifically naming Curly's wife was in January 2023, so that was just 1 year ago. And the question was, Curly's wife is just a foolish girl who makes foolish choices. Now, as a quotation, you could agree or disagree with the view expressed there. To answer that question, you would answer, to what extent do you agree with this statement? And of course, remember to support your answer with reference to the novel and to comment on its social, historical, and cultural context. So it's up to you if you can feel some sympathy for Curly's wife. That could make an excellent essay. Or if you feel like Curly's wife deserved what happened to her, again, makes an excellent essay. In January 2020, how does John Steinbeck use the relationship between Curley and his wife to highlight some aspects of society in 1930s America? Again, a very interesting question. I think you can do a good job of that one. And then just before that, in January 2018, in Curly's wife, Steinbeck has created a character who brings all her troubles on herself. Now, what you'll notice from the two questions deliberately on Curly's wife on her own, it shows that you'll need to engage with the idea of whether she deserves what happens to her or whether we can feel sympathy for her. So even though Curly's wife has only appeared 3 times, you'll also see that it doesn't matter what theme turns up, you're probably going to link Curly's wife into it. So I've picked some examples. In January 2024, this question turned up. It was about dreams and ambitions. And I think in this type of question, it would be completely sensible to show that Curly's wife has her dreams of escaping the Great Depression, and they are to emulate what she sees in cinema pictures. Her way of escaping the hardship is through finding the adoration and love of the public by being an actress. She'll be able to earn money for herself, she'll be able to be self-sustained, and she'll be able to escape the cruelty of her marriage too. In January 2023, the essay title was about freedom. Again, Curly's wife as a character is almost desperate for freedom. And just another example, in January 2022, loneliness affects the characters in Of Mice and Men in different ways. And I think Curly's wife would make an excellent case study in that type of essay. So whether she turns up as a named character or whether it's a theme, Curly's wife will make her way into lots of different types of essays. Focus of this video is to make sure you've got all of the information you need for the full context essay, the second question that turns up on the WJC exam paper. Now, as a result, we must understand context and we must link that context to the character. So the whole point of this type of essay is to show you understand the character and how she tells us something about the 1930s, but also how understanding things about the 1930s can illuminate that character too. So we've got to go over this context to make sure you really understand why this character has been created. Now, Of Mice and Men is set during the 1930s, and the 1930s were a time of economic hardship and also social hardship. It was an incredibly difficult time to be alive. But the decade before, the Roaring Twenties, were actually a really nice time to be alive. Herbert Hoover said about the 20s, just before the Wall Street crash, that America was at its closest it's ever been to eradicating poverty for good. So the Roaring Twenties were a time of excess, were a time of financial security, were a time where people had money, disposable money that they could spend on luxury goods, not just the basics to survive. Now, being a woman in the 1920s You often saw very stylish, very elegant, different types of women presented in the media. You had socialites who would go around New York dressing in fancy clothes, and lots of women aspired to that level of freedom. Now, the image that I've placed on the right-hand side of your screen is the image of the flapper girl. And those flapper girls had greater freedoms than people may have had in the past. It was a more liberal time for women. They could adorn themselves with luxury dresses and makeups and perfumes. They had freedoms like going to bars and drinking and smoking and dancing. And women could, during the 1920s, have white-collar jobs and earn their own money. So to be a woman in the 1920s was perhaps a little better than it might have been in the past. Women also had the freedom to vote. So being a woman in the 1920s was actually not as bad as it was later in the 1930s. In the 1930s, however, after the Wall Street crash of 1929, the Great Depression hit, which meant that the role of women reverted. Those images of women adorning themselves in luxury clothing all of a sudden weren't looked up towards, they weren't seen as things to aspire towards. Then all of a sudden they started to be seen as wasteful, and the role of women went back a step. Because women were expected to be frugal at this time. If your entire family has lost all its money, spending money on expensive dresses and makeup would be seen as irresponsible. Frugal here means being careful with money. Buying makeup, dresses, wasting money on dance halls, that's a wasteful attitude. And in the 1930s, people didn't have money to spend on those luxury goods. In the 1930s, there was a surplus of available labor, which meant finding employment would have been really difficult, especially if you were a woman. Having a job, for a woman having a job in the 1930s, was also seen as selfish because there were so many women, there were so many men desperately looking for a job. For a woman to take that job, that was seen as a woman denying the man of another family to provide for their family. And many wives stayed at home to look after the children, and lots of men became itinerant workers in search of employment. So it might be that within a couple, the man becomes quite distant from the woman. The man might have to travel the length of the country looking for work to send back to his family, which means being a wife could be quite a lonely existence. On your own, looking after a family without much money doesn't sound like the type of experience a woman in the 1920s would have been looking forward to. And this leads us on to the golden age of Hollywood. Now, everything we've said so far fits into the character of Curly's wife. Curly's wife almost wants to go back to the 1920s and be that type of flapper girl who gets nice dresses and can wear nice clothes. She wants to escape the 1930s, that hardship, the loneliness in her relationship. She wants to go back in time, to the time when women perhaps had a little bit more freedom. Now, as we move on, we're going to take a look at the golden age of Hollywood. Because during the 1930s, there were lots of famous women who were able to be actresses during this time. And Hollywood films of the 1930s offered a temporary escape from the hardships of the Great Depression. If you're living a miserable existence, you could go to the cinema and for 2 or 3 hours maybe escape some of that hardship, and for a little bit of time escape into a dream world where perhaps things are not so terrible. So movies, films could offer temporary release of the hardship and pain, a little bit like we see with Curly's wife. Curly's wife is constantly popping into these little dreams about the future that she might have, a little bit like the 1930s looking to films as a source of escape. In the 1930s, there were Hollywood stars like Ginger Rogers, Betty Davis, and Greta Garbo, and they were adored by the nation. They were beautiful, glamorous, and respected, and they offered young women an opportunity to see women earning for themselves, living a happier life, not living through the horrible times of the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. Now, these women would often have films that were comedies or romance films. Again, these women from the 1930s would have seen women existing outside of that bubble of hardship. And I think Curley's wife desperately looks to Hollywood as a way of her escaping her horrible existence. Now, the 1930s was a patriarchal society. Women were expected not to burden their families by finding a man to look after them. So the expectation is that if you have a daughter, that daughter, as soon as possible, will go out and find a man so that the father will no longer have to look after them. To stay at home with your family might have seen as something irresponsible. Women were expected to accept the dominance of the husband. The husband would be in charge, and it would be the role of the woman to comply with what the man wanted to do. There was an expectation in the 1930s, which was a religious time in American history. There was the expectation of being monogamous. Monogamous means to be in a relationship with a single person, and to avoid promiscuity. In the 1930s, promiscuity was looked down upon. Promiscuity means having multiple partners. And women were expected to be dutiful and docile and compliant. And if you take a look at some of those descriptions of the expectations of a woman in a patriarchal society, Curley's wife doesn't seem to fit in. She doesn't want to accept the dominance of her husband because she doesn't like him and she doesn't think he's a nice person. She looks to other men to fulfill her yearning for company, and she defies her husband. There's only one time in the entire book where we actually see husband and wife in the same room together, and that's when Curley's wife is actually dead. Curley's wife only appears in this book a handful of times. We first hear about Curley's wife through Candy, who tells us about her reputation, and he does so in fairly misogynistic language. He looks down on Curley's wife, almost laughs at her and laughs at Curley as well. We then see her introduced in the second chapter where she stands at the door. We then see the way she treats crooks. Then we see her alone with Lenny, and she shares how unhappy she is, and she shares that she has a dream for the future. And then finally, we see her dead, lying on the hay, finally at peace. So Curley's wife only appears in the text a handful of times. So if we take a look first at how she is presented when we've not even met her before. Now, the first thing I think it's important to say is that we never learn her name. Like lots of the characters in this book, we only hear about her in the way that she is referred to, and in this case it's Curley's wife. And that tells us something from the very start. The fact that she is Curley's wife presents her as almost a possession. She belongs to her husband. We could call her chattels. Chattels is a legal term for something that comes with a property. Curley's wife, therefore, is denied an identity of her own. And that could be Steinbeck's way of suggesting that many women during the 1930s weren't able to fulfill their lives. They weren't able to have a life where they were happy and could do what they want. They were very much bound to duty. So with Curley's wife only ever referred to as Curley's wife, it suggests that her entire identity has been boiled down to duty. And it doesn't match who she really is or who she would like to be. So it may be indicative of how many women were treated during the 1930s, having to simply be a mum who stays at home looking after those children. Now, when Candy first introduces her, it's almost through ridicule. And he tells George, "Wait till you see Curley's wife." Almost as if Curley's wife is a spectacle and something to be laughed at. He does say, yeah, pretty, but. So Curley's wife is physically beautiful, and the word but here that Candy uses suggests that she may be superficially beautiful, but there is something wrong with her. which suggests that Curley's wife does not fulfill the expectations of a woman during the 1930s. Her willfulness, her headstrong nature, or her desperately looking for company from other people shows that she's flawed in some way. So she's not seen as someone to be admired by Candy. If we think about women in the 21st century, a headstrong woman who does what she wants could be admired. It shows us that Curly's wife is not to be admired because she doesn't do what is expected of her by society. He tells us, well, she got the eye. Now, the eye here refers to her being flirtatious. She looks at other men as sources of company. We know why later on in the book. But the eye here tells us that she's perhaps restless. She doesn't have a myopic viewpoint. Myopic means focused on one thing. She doesn't just focus on her husband. She doesn't get what she needs from her husband. So as a result, she goes looking for it somewhere else. And the word I there definitely connotes the idea of looking for something that is missing. Candy tells us, I've seen her give Slim the eye, and I've seen her give Carlson the eye. That flirtatiousness is a part of Curly's wife's reputation, and the men look down at her because of it. She is seen in a derogatory light. We can then move on to the first time we actually see Curly's wife herself. Now, the first mention of her when we see her is she's described as a girl. Now, a girl there, not the girl, a girl with that indefinite article a, suggests that this would have been like many women during the 1930s, many young girls in the 1930s. They also would have been trapped in an existence that would have been disappointing to them. Girl also suggests perhaps a sense of innocence. We see Curly's wife and we know she's not innocent because she flirts with lots of men. There is an innocence to her, almost like she doesn't understand the repercussions of her actions. A girl might make her sound juvenile. We could almost feel a sense of protection about a girl, even though her description of her is of somebody much more flirtatious and much more promiscuous. And then we look at her physical description, and you will notice a constant lexical set of makeup and superficial appearance, and a lexical set of red. We're constantly given this description of how red she looks, with full rouged lips and wide spaced eyes, heavily made up. And I think it's perhaps a little deeper than just that she's wearing makeup. Now, the word rouged means red here. Her lips are red, which connotes a sexuality about this woman. She's perhaps flirtatious. She's seductive. She lures men towards her with these bright colors. Rouge also suggests passion. So this is somebody who's looking for passion and excitement. Her full rouged lips and wide spaced eyes heavily made up gives us this description of a woman who spends a long time on her appearance. And again, we can consider that in two different ways. On the one hand, it might show that she wants to look a particular way to attract men. So it may be that she's quite superficial. On the other hand, it could also tell us that she has a lot of time on her hands. Because as a woman during the 1930s, she doesn't have children yet. So her role in life is actually quite empty. She's sitting at home all day waiting for her husband to return. She has nothing to do. She has no purpose. And to have no purpose is quite a dangerous quality. We find out her fingernails were red, again with red symbolizing that passion and seductiveness. But the constant reference to red is also something else. When Lenny sees this woman, he sees a beautiful woman that he would like to be near. When George sees this woman, he sees nothing but danger. Red signifies danger. If the next time you walk across the street, you see a red light, it means danger. Children learn that red means danger from a very early age. If something is red, it's either poisonous or it's hot. Red hurts people. So perhaps Steinbeck is showing us that when women are so desperate for attention that they are willing to go out and seduce men, then there is danger there to society. Danger for the women, but also danger for the men. Now, George is very, very good at noticing danger. And that's because he understands that in the 1930s, you had to be careful because society was a hostile place. It was a dog-eat-dog world, a Darwinian society where only the strong win. Lenny doesn't understand that red means danger, and he doesn't understand just how hostile the world is. We also find out that her hair hung in little rolled clusters like sausages. And the simile there shows just how much effort she puts into her appearance, perhaps to find some sort of human connection with another person, or perhaps to be flirtatious and lure a man away. I have had some students in the past maybe suggest that the fact that she is described, where her hair is described like sausages, sausages are something to be eaten and consumed. So perhaps there is an element where Curley's wife is only useful when consumed. It's an interesting idea. I've heard that interpretation a couple of times. Now, when she is described, she has a cotton house dress on. And if you imagine this is a woman living on a ranch, a cotton house dress is not very practical for living on a ranch, which perhaps shows us that whilst she lives on the ranch, she doesn't really belong there. She has no purpose. She's not allowed to work. Her cotton house dress is maybe a reference to the fact that she isn't where she wants to be. A cotton house dress. She also has red mules, on the insteps of which were little bouquets of red ostrich feathers. And red mules always confuses people, so there's a picture to show you what a red mule is. Again, we've got this red that means danger and seduction, but we also have this description of red ostrich feathers. Now, there is an interpretation of red ostrich feathers which might reveal a little bit more about Curley's wife. If I were to say that an ostrich is a bird that does not fly, then that might give us a clue as to why Steinbeck might have used it. Birds often represent freedom. The feathers allow birds to fly. If you can fly, you can go where you want, you can be where you want, you can find freedom. Curley's wife is like a bird that cannot fly. She cannot be free. She cannot find her salvation. She cannot be where she wants to be, which suggests that, like an ostrich, she is trapped where she is. She cannot find freedom, and she can't just leave whenever she wants to. Now, as this is the 1930s, divorce was frowned upon. She wouldn't be able to find another husband if she left her current husband. Her mother probably won't be able to accept her back because she could be living through the hardship of the 1930s Great Depression too. Curley's wife finds herself in a position where she cannot escape. She is trapped. Like the other men on this ranch, she is trapped. She doesn't have a future and she has no means of escape. She can't get a job of her own and she can't leave her husband. So she is forever stuck. That's the interpretation, what we might want to say about ostrich feathers. When she is standing in the door, she is described as she put her hands against the door frames, that her body was thrown forward. And I think from this quotation, you can see that she is not going to be given any attention by her personality. So what she has to do is to use her physical body to try and gain attention. She has to fight for attention. So throwing her body forward is her way of enticing these men into being interested with her. And then she bridled a little, She looked at her fingernails. Bridle shows that she's enjoying the attention that Lenny is giving her. And looking at her fingernails, she's trying to look playful and she's trying to be flirtatious. She's trying to suggest that she doesn't mind if these men look at her, whilst really she's absolutely desperate for their attention. She says, "If he ain't, I better look someplace else," and she said playfully. Now, the adverb playfully shows that to her, she's enjoying having someone to talk to. And at first glance, we can see that, she's making trouble and she's being flirtatious. But we know from later in the book that she's desperately lonely and desperately looking for some attention. And there is a sense of irony as well. When she's told that Curley isn't in the bunkhouse, she doesn't leave to go and look for her husband. She stays there. So the irony is she says that she's looking for her husband, but what she's really doing is she's looking for somebody to talk to. She's looking for some attention. She's not looking for her trapping husband or her marriage. She's looking elsewhere to find happiness. And she tells George and Lenny, nobody can't blame a person for looking. Again, she's being flirtatious and she's being seductive, and she's trying to lure people like Lenny into giving her some kind of attention. So she sounds really attention-seeking from the first moment we see her. Now, when Curly's wife leaves, we see George use misogynistic slurs towards her, and this links in to some of the language that was used towards her by Candy too. So Candy first introduces her as a tart. So what he does is he looks at Curly's wife, looks at how she doesn't meet the expectations of women during the 1930s, and as a result labels her as problematic, labels her as the type of person that would cause trouble. And George does the same thing. He says, "Jesus, what a tramp." And if you think of the connotations of a tramp, perhaps someone who doesn't belong anywhere, perhaps someone who doesn't live where they should, we can see that underneath the horrible attention-seeking facade is perhaps someone underneath that is desperately looking for their happiness because they're not living in a happy situation. Now, when Lenny gets a little bit excited, George tells Lenny, "Don't you even take a look at that bitch." And again, he vilifies Curly's wife for her personality. Because she's so desperate for attention, George can see that that desperation is going to cause trouble and it's going to cause pain. Lenny doesn't see that danger at all. He describes Curly's wife as a poison. And if you think about the connotations of poison, something that causes destruction and something that causes pain, that's a really horrible way to describe a woman. And he also describes her as a piece of jailbait. Now, bait is something that lures an animal or lures someone in. A jail is a place of punishment. What George sees in Curly's wife is someone who doesn't meet society expectations, and as a result will mean a man will make a decision that they will later regret. When George sees Curly's wife, he doesn't see a human, he doesn't see a person. What he sees is something dangerous that could cause pain. And again, this links back to how people treated each other in the 1930s. Because people were constantly wandering around the country, desperately looking for work as itinerant or migrant workers, people began to associate other people as danger or hostility. And the 1930s was a very competitive time too. So George has become very good at seeing the danger in people. And I think that tells us a little bit about Curly's wife as well. She's not seen as a girl, she's not seen as a person, she's seen as trouble. And he describes her as a rat trap. And the rat trap here, again, connotes that idea of being caught. If you go anywhere near Curly's wife, she is going to cause pain and she's going to cause suffering. And as we know, George is always right, isn't he? Underneath Curly's wife's desperate attempts to have some kind of human interaction is a real yearning for company. Now, she might do this in a sexually seductive way, But I don't actually think that's what she's looking for. She's not looking for sexual satisfaction. She's looking for an emotional connection with another person because she doesn't receive that on this ranch at all. She has nobody to talk to and she has nobody who will actually listen to her. In the fourth chapter, when she turns up to Crooks's harness room, we hear that her lips were slightly parted. She breathed strongly as though she had been running. And I think this is a really sad quotation because I think Curly's wife has seen the men go into the harness room and has literally chased them, has run to catch up with them because then maybe she'll get some company. So the fact that she's breathing heavily, I think, is signs of her desperation, and it's desperation for company. And I think it's really sad that Curly's wife has to try and chase down company and isn't just getting it from her husband. She tells us in the harness room, think I don't like to talk to somebody every once in a while? Think I like to stick in that house all the time? And the fact that she says she wants to talk to somebody, it doesn't even matter who it is. She just wants some company, and she sounds very similar there to Crooks, who also is desperately looking for company, just someone to see him as an equal. Because Curly's wife, as a woman in the 1930s, was not treated as an equal, was not worthy of attention. Where it says, think I don't like to talk to somebody every once in a while, it makes her sound really unhappy. And she tells us, like many women during the 1930s, I imagine, being stuck in the house all of the time with no job to go to or no purpose in society apart from to make your husband happy, to fulfill his needs, and to fulfill the needs of your children, that might seem like quite an empty and quite a frustrating existence. So when she says, think I like to stick in that house all the time, it shows us that she has no real purpose, and Curly's wife is the type of person that does want to be fulfilled. And she tells us when talking to possibly the three weakest characters on this ranch, she's standing here talking to a bunch of bindle stiffs. A bindle stiff here showing that she looks down on the three people that she sees. All the other men, it's a Saturday night, have gone into town to enjoy themselves. And Curly's wife, like the other three, Brooks and Candy and Lenny, is alone and without company. Now she uses the racist slur to refer to Crooks. She uses dum-dum to describe Lenny, and she describes Candy as a lousy old sheep. But she says even though these people are weak, that she actually really likes it, because it doesn't matter who she talks to, she just wants some company. She just wants to be emotionally fulfilled. Now this quotation also shows us that Curly's wife is very, very good at identifying people's weaknesses. She can see that Crooks's character is weak because of the skin color, and that Lenny's mental capacity isn't particularly strong, and Candy is an old person. She's also able to identify the weakness in others, just like her weakness is constantly identified through the fact that she is a woman. And it's at this point we can start looking at her relationship with Curly. And this is where we may start to feel some sympathy for Curly's wife. Now, don't get me wrong, she's not a particularly nice character, and the way she treats Crooks later is obviously abhorrent. But we can feel some sympathy for Curly's wife, especially with her relationship with her husband. She flares up when somebody tells her to go and spend time with her husband. The word flare there shows some violence and aggression because she doesn't want to spend time with her husband because he's not a very nice man. And she says, sure, I got a husband, swell guy, ain't he? And what she does there is tells us that her husband is not a very nice person. So being trapped in a relationship with somebody you think is violent or potentially abusive is not a very nice thing to do. But the suggestion is that Curly's wife should tolerate that relationship because she's a woman in the 1930s and women are supposed to be docile and compliant. She also knows where Curly is. She says, "Think I don't know where they all went, even Curly." Now she knows her husband has gone to town to visit some prostitutes. Now that does tell us that Curly clearly is physically close to women, and he might be physically close with Curly's wife too. But that isn't what Curly's wife is looking for at all. She doesn't care about a physical and intimate relationship. She's looking for an emotionally intimate relationship. And Curly denies her that. Curly doesn't give her a relationship where she feels happy and safe. But because this is the 1930s, Curly's wife is expected to tolerate it. And she tells us that he spends all his time saying what he's going to do to guys he don't like. And he don't like nobody. The description of Curly is that he is physically strong and powerful. That isn't what Curly's wife actually needs. It's tenderness and intimacy. And we then see that Curly's wife is absolutely desperate for escape. And this is where the imagery of the ostrich feathers from earlier, where I said that it could connote the fact that she wants freedom but is denied it. This is where we can see that Curly's wife really is trapped in a situation where she is never going to find happiness. He tells us, "I tell you, I could have went with shows, not just one, neither. And a guy told me he could put me in pictures." Now this is where we see Curly's wife and her dream. Now, unlike the American dream of George and Candy, her dream is to escape by being famous, by using her talents, by seen as desirable and seen as talented. She wants to live in the world that she sees on movie screens. She wants to escape the 1930s by being famous. And she once says that she met a guy. And I think it's interesting that a guy is anonymous. This isn't just a guy, it could have been any guy. And she genuinely believed that this man that she met was going to put her in the movies. Now, it sounds like she was chatted up at a bar, but she is so desperate to believe that she can escape her hardship that she's willing to trust a man she's never met before and to take him at face value. I think it's a sign of how desperate she is to escape. I think Candy is desperate to escape by offering all of his money to George and Lenny, two guys he met only a day before. And then later with Crooks. Crooks is so desperate to escape that he's willing to work for free on ranch. I think she's so desperate for her life to mean something that she's willing to listen to people when they flatter her. Curly's wife senses that Lenny is a weak character and that maybe she will get more joy pursuing him than some of the other men because of his mental faculties. He looked from one face to another and they were all closed against her. Now that quotation, when we're in the harness room, shows that all of the men seem to push her away. And they push her away because she is a sign of danger. They push her away because during the 1930s, you weren't supposed to get involved in other people's men. You push them away. They're supposed to be wives and women. They're not wives and mothers. They're not supposed to be seductive and not supposed to look for attention from other people. But it then tells us she looked longest at Lenny until he dropped his eyes in embarrassment. And that action from Lenny is picked up on by Curly's wife. She notices that Lenny is the one that she is most likely to get attention from. So she pursues him. And she says, "Okay, machine, I'll talk to you later." So Curly's wife knows that of all of the people on the ranch, she is going to get some attention from Lenny. And she also says the very seductive phrase, "I like machines." And it shows that she is desperately seeking some attention. And when we find out that Lenny is desperately looking for rabbits, she says, well, if that's all you want, I might get a couple of rabbits myself. And I think it really does show how desperate she is. She has to think of elaborate ways to gain attention, in this case, by getting something that Lenny wants, just so that he will spend some time with her. Curly's wife is never offered intimacy. She has to go and find it, she has to demand it, but by doing that, she's also not fulfilling the expectations of a woman. And then we get onto the really dark and sinister side of Curly's wife, because she racially threatens Crooks with some very, very powerful sentences. And she says to Crooks, listen, she said, you know what I could do to you if you open your trap. Now, the beginning of that sentence where she says listen, that's an imperative. The imperative verb listen is very much telling Crooks that he must do as he says. Because Curly's wife senses that she has more power than Crooks does. So she places herself then in a position of authority. And it's quite similar to the way that Curly speaks when we first see him. When he says, "Seen my old man?" He's very demanding. And Curly's wife here becomes very commanding towards Crooks. And what she says is a really sinister and dark threat. She never mentions what that threat is, but we know what that threat is. She says, you know what I can do to you if you open your trap. And if you look at the pronouns there, she mentions you quite a few times, and then she mentions herself once. She realizes that she does hold power over Crooks. Maybe the only character in the whole book she holds power over. And she abuses that power. Now, what she's referencing there is the idea of a lynch mob. All she has to do is to make one accusation, and in the 1930s, a group of men would bandy together and they would deal out their own version of justice. So no trial, no jury. If she were to make an accusation against Crooks, that would be enough for these men to get together, to chase him down and to execute him. It's an enormous amount of power, and she uses that power to threaten him. And then she says, well, you keep your place then. And she uses the racial slur deliberately to put him in his place, to put him below her in the hierarchy of this ranch. And she tells us, I could get you strung up on a tree, it ain't even funny. And there's a reference here to the idea of lynching a black person, which is a horrible thing to say. Remember, the 1930s is a time when the Ku Klux Klan were in operation. So this is a very, very dark and sinister threat that she makes. And once she has threatened him, she doesn't leave him alone for a second. It says, for a moment she stood over him. Again, I think symbolic of the power she has over him, as though waiting for him to move so that she could whip at him again. Now, the word whip there, the onomatopoeic but also very violent and aggressive language being used, shows that Curly's wife has been treated badly for a long time. And because of that, it makes it easier for her to treat other people badly too. And we've talked about this before. The reason why Crooks becomes bitter is because he's had a whole life of being treated badly. I think what we can see is that when Curly's wife is neglected of any attention and any happiness, she becomes quite a sinister character. And I think that's one of the main messages of Steinbeck's book, which is if we treat people badly, they generally treat others badly too. But when someone treats someone with friendship and kindness, like George does to Lenny, then maybe we can see a route out of this horrible society of the 1930s. So for Curly's wife, she sounds really dark and really quite aggressive in this scene. And this takes us to the almost last time we see Curly's wife. She seeks company from Lenny. She identified that Lenny was the one that might give her some attention. So she goes seeking it. And she tells Lenny, because Lenny does what George says, which is tries to get out of the conversation, tries to move away. But she asks Lenny, why can't I talk to you? I never get to talk to nobody. I get awful lonely. And it's the first time that Curly's wife really shows that she is unhappy. Before this, she seems upset and angry and frustrated. But here, she seems to open up with Lenny and she actually identifies what it is that makes her so unhappy. And it's her loneliness. She's denied human compassion and human connection. And that question, why can't I talk to you, is very direct because it's very difficult to explain why these men don't want to engage with her at all. They don't see her as a fellow human, they see her as something else. And she asks Lenny the rhetorical question because she realizes she can manipulate Lenny and she can get him to talk by asking questions. She says, how would you like not to talk to anybody? And I think that's probably Steinbeck's voice. That's a wider point than just Curly's wife. I think Steinbeck is trying to show us that, yeah, if we stop communicating, if we stop treating people with friendship and companionship, then the whole world becomes lonely and miserable, and it becomes a darker place to be. As we get to the climax of the book, we see that Curly's wife's loneliness is probably the reason why she gets killed. Because she is so desperate for attention that she cannot see the dangers. And the dangers are obvious, but she's blinded by her own desperation. When Curly's wife sees Lenny, there is clear evidence that Lenny is a character that is dangerous and can cause pain, suffering, and death. Because she realizes the dog is dead. Why, he's dead, she cried. She realizes that Lenny has killed this puppy and yet doesn't equate that to her own safety. Because she then consoled him. She says, don't you worry none, he was just a mutt. You can get another one, easy. The whole country is full of mutts. And I think that quotation is a very important quotation. That is one that I would maybe make a note of for the exam. Because this isn't just to show that Curly's wife is so desperate for attention that she doesn't see the danger. It also tells us something about 1930s society. During the 1930s, because there was a surplus of available workers, people became seen as disposable. If a worker wasn't doing a very good job, you could get rid of them immediately because there were 20, 30, 40, 100 people who would be willing to take that one job. So when she sees the dead puppy and she equates that to just another dog, it's fine, there are plenty of other dogs there, it also shows us that during the 1930s, human beings were also seen as disposable. And if one of them wasn't any good anymore, you could just get rid of him. And we see that quite clearly in the character of Candy as well, don't we? And even though she can see, right, clear danger, this man has just killed this puppy, look at the verbs being used, she moved closer to him and she spoke soothingly. So instead of seeing danger and leaving, like George does, she sees the danger, is blinded to it, and still seeks that emotional connection. And she spoke soothingly because she wants some attention from Lenny. It's more than just emotional attention. Curly's wife wants to be heard. She wants to communicate. She wants somebody to listen because she's got things to say. She's got things to get off her chest. The description of her speaking to Lenny, I think, is really sad. She says, and then her words tumbled out in a passion of communication, as though she hurried before her listener could be taken away. And that tells us a lot about Curly's wife. That's the one thing she doesn't have. She isn't given a voice. She isn't even given a name. Curly's wife wants somebody to listen to her. She wants to be able to tell her story. She wants to be able to share her dreams and aspirations. And perhaps this is a wider point. Maybe women in general in the 1930s deserved to be listened to. Because women were placed in subservient positions, I'm sure there's lots of men talking and lots of men revealing what their dreams and aspirations are, but women were just expected to tolerate. So here, perhaps Curley's wife is absolutely desperate to speak to someone because the 1930s wasn't a time of listening. She tells us she went on with her story quickly before she could be interrupted. Now, Lenny isn't listening to a word she's saying, but she doesn't mind. She just wants to have a person there that she can get things off her chest with. She tells us that she doesn't deserve the life that she's been given in the 1930s, being someone's wife and ignored. She believes that she deserves better, and she tells us what she would like from the world. She tells us, I could have made something of myself, she said darkly. Maybe I will yet. And here Curly's wife is showing us that she believes she has something to offer. She believes she has talents and skills that would be useful and could be admired. And the words I could have and maybe I will, I think those words shows that she still feels like she has something to offer. I mean, as a reader, we know that she will never make something of herself because the conditions of the 1930s were not conducive of allowing her to. But it shows that women need a purpose too. In the 1930s, women needed a sense of purpose, and yet they were denied it because the needs of men were placed first. And she continues with the dream that she has. She says, well, a show came through, and I met one of the actors. He said I could go with that show. And it continues this description of Curly's wife genuinely believing that someone who flattered her actually had her best interest at heart. I think most readers can see that the men she was speaking to at these dance halls or bars were not necessarily thinking about the happiness of Curly's wife, but maybe their own happiness, and they were simply using her. And when it said I could go with that show is symbolic of freedom. She felt like that's how she could have escaped her life, by doing something meaningful, by acting and by being loved by lots of people. And she tells us, another time I met a guy and he was in pictures. He says he was going to put me in the movies, says I was a natural. Soon as he got back to Hollywood, he was going to write to me about it. Now, from these quotations on the screen, we could accuse Curly's wife of being gullible, maybe naive, desperately believing that there is a path in life that will allow her to be happy. But I think most people would argue that there is no escape for her. This is not a viable route in life. She's never going to end up in Hollywood, and she's never going to end up in those pictures. This is a dream that she has, and it's a dream of escape and freedom. It's like Lenny's dream. George never really believed. Brooks never really believed. Curly's wife is desperately believing this, which makes her sound gullible, even though she scoffs at the dream of the men. So I think Hollywood, movies, pictures, shows, it all shows that she believes there is a path out there for her, but she is cruelly denied that path, and she's left lost in the 1930s. Now, the way I would argue this is I think Curly's wife actually wants to go back to the 1920s when the times might have been better for women. I think she's probably locked in the wrong decade, and she just had the misfortune of growing up and living during a really difficult time in Americans' history. What she's looking for is, she says, could have been in the movies and had nice clothes. All them nice clothes like they wear. With the 1930s being a time of such economic hardship, she's looking for a time when she would be able to have the finer luxuries in life. Now, she does spend some money clearly on cotton house dresses and makeup, but she wants to live in a time where she would be free to wear that type of clothing and not be ridiculed for it. Perhaps like in the 1920s when women did have a little bit more liberty. Or in Hollywood films where women are respected for the way they look and not looked down upon like Curly's wife is. And she tells us about what she'd like. And I could have sat in them big hotels and had pictures took of me. When they had them previews, I could have went to them and spoke in the radio, and it wouldn't have cost me a cent. Now, if you pick out some of the words, like her wanting to live in big hotels, I think that's symbolic of her desire to escape. People go to hotel as a momentary escape from their real life. Curly's wife doesn't want to live in Curly's house anymore. She'd love to live in these big hotels instead. Having pictures taken of her, people take pictures of people they admire and respect. Curly's wife wants a life when she can be respected for who she is and not looked down upon as a rat trap or jailbait. And she says she'd like to speak on the radio. Spoke here shows that she wants to be listened to and adored, because in her life, none of the men want to listen to her, and Curly doesn't want to listen to her either. It's really sad that Curly's wife's desperation to escape the Great Depression led to a breakdown in her family, and it led her to make some really bad decisions. So she thought a man was going to write to her and offer her a place in a show. And she tells us that I never got that letter, she said. I always thought my old lady stole it. Well, I wasn't going to stay in no place where I couldn't get nowhere or make something of myself. Now, what we can see is that the 1930s was a time of mistrust. With people constantly moving around the country, you'd often have different people turn up and you wouldn't trust them. Now here she tells us that she doesn't trust her old lady, her mother. So what she does is she's so desperately believing that there's a man out there that will value her that she actually turns on her own mother and vilifies her instead of realizing that this man was lying to her. Now I think she does that because she was that desperate to escape. And what is really sad is that we get this really short sentence, which is, so I married Curly. Almost in spite of her mother, or almost as if that was the only escape she could get, was by marrying Curly. This is clearly not a marriage of love. It was almost a marriage of trying to escape. And ironically, she's married into a situation where there is no escape. And this brings us to the really sad confession that she does not love her husband and that she's trapped in a loveless relationship, a position that no one would envy. She tells Lenny, I don't like Curly. He ain't a nice fella. And what's really sad is that even though she doesn't like her husband, society would have told her to stay, to endure that relationship because she's married. And in the 1930s, divorce would have been really looked down upon. And she couldn't escape that marriage anyway because she wouldn't have a way of earning money for herself. So she seems trapped in a horrible relationship. And the way she describes Curly when she's talking about her own hair is she says, take Curly, his hair is just like wire. And the wire there is symbolic of his rough and coarse personality. Curly is not the type of person that would make a girl happy. And her desperation, her loneliness is so strong that she continues to overlook danger And that's where we meet the climax of this text. She says to Lenny, "You're a kinda nice fella, just like a big baby, but a person can see kind of what you mean." Now, what she sees in Lenny is his vulnerabilities, and his kindness and his innocence. And I think we can all see that Lenny is like a big baby. But what Curly's wife does is, because she can see that she can talk to this person, she overlooks the more sinister side to Lenny. And all the way through this book, there are constant reminders of how dangerous Lenny can be. From what happened in Weed, to the mouse in his pocket, to the dead puppy, to the fight with Curly. We've seen all the way through this text just how dangerous he can be, and Curly's wife has seen it as well. She knows that Lenny was the person who beat up her husband. But she's so desperate for communication that she overlooks the danger in hope of some kind of connection. And I think this next quotation is one that's essential for the character of Curly's wife, because she literally takes Lenny's hand and put it on her head. She sticks out her neck, the most vulnerable part of her body, and takes Lenny's enormous paw and puts his hand on her head. And I think that's not a desperation for physical intimacy, but a desperation for emotional intimacy. And she says, "Feel right around there and see how soft it is." It's Curly's wife's desperation for comfort, communication, and happiness. That's really what's to blame for her death. And no woman should ever feel in that level of entrapment. Now, as we get to Curly's wife's death, I think it's really important to realize that Curly's wife's last moments on Earth are a struggle for freedom. And I think I would probably argue that her entire life has been a struggle for freedom. So her dying, struggling, is probably quite fitting for the way she lived her life. When she is about to die, she screamed then. And again, that scream, of course, it's out of pain and about of fear. But I would probably argue that scream is also women across the globe, women across America in the 1930s, all screaming out that they've got needs too. And the 1930s Great Depression actually robbed them of their own satisfaction of their needs. It says she struggled violently under his hands. I think that's a wider point about women in general. Women have struggled for centuries under the hands of men. A patriarchal society that doesn't value the needs of women, these women are struggling desperately. And her feet pattered on their hay and she writhed to be free. So in the context of the text, yes, of course she's writhing to be free from Lenny's grasp. But I think I'd argue that that is women in general writhing to be free of oppression. And Curly's wife's death is really quite a sad description. As soon as she's killed, it was very quiet in the barn. And I think there's a deliberate reason why Steinbeck makes the scene go so silent. And I think it's probably because Curly's wife has desperately tried to fight and manipulate and try to find happiness and communication. And for the first time in her life, she no longer has to fight to find happiness or fight to find peace. Peace is there only in death. And I think the description of what happens immediately in the aftermath, where a pigeon flew in through the open hay door and circled a few times, circled and flew out again. I think that pigeon can symbolize Curly's wife, perhaps symbolizing her soul. Her soul can be free of all of the hardship of the 1930s, but only in death. Her whole life she was trapped in that relationship, or trapped at home, or trapped in a place that didn't value her. And it's only in death does she get the wings of a pigeon, because in life she had the wings of an ostrich that cannot fly. And it's only in death do we see this long syndetic list. It's only in death do we see all of her frustrations and pain disappear. Steinbeck says, and the meanness and the plannings and the discontent and the ache for attention were all gone from her face. Now, I don't think we're supposed to be happy that Curley's wife is dead so that she can be at peace. I think it's supposed to be tragic, because as a woman in the 1930s, there should have been an opportunity for her to find peace while alive. And I think the fact that she could only find it in death shows that during the 1930s, women tolerated pain their entire lives, and that isn't the way it should be. Women should be allowed to find their own happiness while alive, not just waiting for death. It also shows us that the reason why she was such a mean character is because she was denied opportunities that would have made her happy. And one of her last descriptions is completely different from her first description. So no longer do we have the constant description of makeup or perfectly curled hair. Now we get a completely different lexical set, a lexical set of almost innocence. She was very pretty and simple, and her face was sweet and young. All of that shows us the innocence in this girl. And perhaps it was her feelings of unhappiness because of society that turned her into that attention-seeking character. And now her rouged cheeks and her reddened lips made her seem alive and sleeping very lightly. So her makeup is no longer this sign of desperation, but it now suggests that this girl has now found comfort, magically through death. And those sausages that were described so intricately at the beginning, they now turn into a slightly different symbol. So the curls, tiny little sausages, were spread on the hay behind her head, and her lips were parted. Now her hair almost forms like a halo behind her head, turning her into this almost angelic character. And I think it's supposed to show us that Curley's wife could have been so different. If Curley's wife had an opportunity to get a job and sustain herself, she could have been happy. Or if Curley's wife didn't desperately marry Curley because she felt like she had to, then maybe she would have been happy. If Curley's wife wasn't so desperate to find escape through men in bars and dreams of Hollywood, then perhaps she could have been happy. I do think we are supposed to feel sympathy for her when we see her body finally at peace. And in the final times we see Curley's wife, when she's dead, we see Curley's reaction, and it isn't that of a loving husband. It's that of someone particularly angry and aggressive. The way Curley responds to his wife's death is not with tragedy. He's not upset. He's not yearning for his wife to come back. It's instantly through quick temper, through anger, and through hurting other people. And I think that's completely fitting because Curley never showed any love towards his wife at all. And he doesn't even do that in death either. He says, I'm going to get him. I'm going for my shotgun. And I think that shows us that in the 1930s and during the Great Depression, people were more likely to look for retribution, look for revenge, than actually looking to be communicative with other people. And he says, come on, you guys. And he ran furiously out of the barn. And I think it's important. that he instantly leaves his wife alone. Because again, that's symbolic of the way he and his wife lived their lives. They were never together. Just like itinerant workers and migrant workers in the 1930s, they left their families. They left them alone. That's why Curley's wife is dead, because she was lonely. And Curley leaves her alone at the end of this book. Now it falls to Slim to suggest that he actually stay with his wife. He says, Curley, maybe you better stay here with your wife. I think had Curley maybe done that in life, then his wife wouldn't be dead. But the way he responds to Slim again shows us that this relationship was not close. Curley's face reddened. Curley's face continues to get more and more angry, and he defies Slim. He says, I'm going. And that shows us this increasing distance between him and his wife. We never once see Curley's wife and Curley alive in the same room together. And as soon as we see Curley in the same room as Curley's wife, he abandons her in death too. It's not a relationship of closeness. Now that we've looked at all of the times we see Curley's wife in the book, this is my final remark. I think Curley's wife never got the emotional connection she wanted, and she never felt valued at all. Curley's wife needed to feel safe. Curley's wife needed to feel a connection with someone. Curley's wife needed to feel that maybe she did have a future. Maybe she would be valued. Maybe the world could treat her kindly. And I think Steinbeck denies her of that deliberately to show us that many women during the 1930s were denied options. And women at the time were probably just expected to be a two-dimensional character. And I think that's why Curley's wife is presented without a name, because she shows us that when women are not given any emotional connection at all, they live very unfulfilled, very painful, very miserable lives. And that misery will only spread to others. I think he does that with lots of his different characters. The bitterness we see in the characters is because the world is a bitter place. Now I'm going to finish it with a couple of quotes about Curley that might show us some deeper understanding. At the start of the book, Candy tells us that Curley has a glove full of Vaseline. Now, when we first hear that in the book, we can feel quite uncomfortable about it. Clearly, Curley is keeping this hand soft for his wife. So for physical intimacy, for kind of sexual fulfillment. But I don't think that's what Curley's wife ever wanted. Curley's wife didn't want a husband who was looking after her sexual needs. Curley's wife just wanted someone to talk to. I think the glove full of Vaseline on Curley's hand was not for his wife at all. That glove full of Vaseline was a symbol to the other men that he is successful with women, that he is virile. And I think, if anything, that is a symbol to show that he doesn't understand the needs of his wife. And we hear it that Curley says he's keeping that hand soft for his wife. And I think that symbol is probably the biggest symbol of showing that Curley doesn't understand the needs of his wife at all. Curley goes to visit prostitutes in town. Curley fights men. Curley isn't really focusing on what matters in the world, which are genuine, warm, human compassion and relationships. Now, all the way through this book, we only really see one truly heartwarming relationship, and that's the relationship with George and Lenny. And Steinbeck denies us of that too. And I think one of the biggest messages in this book is that humans need kindness and relationships and warmth. And Curley is one of those characters that denies warmth to his wife, and it ultimately leads to her death. I really hope this video has been of some use to you. Now, you can't memorize all of those quotes. It's not even worth trying. But what you can do, now that you've looked at pretty much every quote there is for Curley's wife, you could Make lists of the quotes you think are most useful. Think about which quotes you would use in an essay plan on Curly's wife or one of the many themes that could turn up. And then you can take those quotes and add it into your revision materials so that you're fully ready for this exam that's coming up quite quickly. Thank you very much for listening to this video. I really hope it's been useful, and I will see you again in the next video. Thank you very much.